On a planet called Origin, this is the map of the Orient, also known as the New World or the Kingdom of Man. Turn your attention to the White Territory. This is Anthropos today, though it wasn't always this big. Before the year 2000, Espiriq, the Pink Territory, was the dominant nation of the Orient. But a huge invasion from Anthropos, along with the mythical appearance of a deity who supposedly validated the blood worship, spelled the end of what Espiriq used to be. In this video, I'll talk about Oriental life and history, starting with Anthropos. West Anthropos is the original Anthropos, before the invasion. Yeah, it used to be just that chunk of land in the northwest of the continent. With the harsh climate change in the past 13 years, that part of the Orient was the only part rich enough to build walls and dams to avoid flooding and receding of land. People of this part of the world have an especially bad inbreeding problem, and as a result have some weird quirks. The reason they're probably inbred in the first place is that they particularly value what they call skin without blemish, which just means a uniform skin color rather than spots or stripes. There are two traceable lineages with this uniform skin, one of which contains the Anthroposian royal guard, and the other contains both the king of Anthropos and also the king of a rival nation I'll talk about soon. A second notable quirk about Western Anthroposians is the common trait of deafness that has to do with their pale blue eyes. If one eye is that pale blue, the same ear will almost always be deaf. If both eyes are pale blue, the person is completely deaf. Because of this, Anthroposian Sign Language, or ASL for short, is particularly common in Western Anthroposian communities. Closer to the borders they have with other countries, there's a problem with the sky. Called the Red Gale, it's characterized by extremely strong hurricane-force winds near dusk that turn the sky a horrible dark red color. No one's completely sure why this is happening, but many say it's the elder god Drazi being pissed off at Anthropos for the whole oil thing. Oh, I gotta talk about that. In 2079, a team led by King Julius Core discovered a substance they call black gold. Burning it creates energy, and that's much cheaper and more efficient than using magic. Using it, an aircraft larger than some islands was built, and put in the air above the sea between Anthropos and Draconia. The burning of fuel to keep this in the sky has caused environmental damage, melting ice caps almost completely by 2092 and causing erratic weather conditions. It's also caused a huge economic boom in Anthropos and the invention of many new technologies that don't involve magic for use in war, such as automobiles and firearms. The economy is really good in Anthropos nowadays, so good that many countries who hate them trade with them. To talk more about Drazi, it's a god that is commonly known about in Western Anthropos and the surrounding regions, but not really worshipped very commonly apart from decentralized cults here and there. Drazi represents different things to different people, but in the Anthroposian Church's lore, he's god of the infinite skies, but also god of the invisible ceiling. He's said to keep fools in their place and maintain the status quo. Because Anthropos was once a country of rebels, that second one has historically been a negative thing about Drazi. Now that Anthropos is the status quo though, it's becoming more common to see Drazi in a positive light as a guardian of the church even if he's not to be worshipped. He guards the invisible ceiling that keeps the lowly in their place, but enables the infinite skies to allow the already powerful to soar yet higher. He's also known as the god of the Great Divide, or just Great Divide. But I also want to talk about a particularly gruesome aspect of Anthroposian culture in general that comes from the capital within Western Anthropos. You heard that they drink the blood of other humans. Let me tell you how they got this blood. It starts with a long history of racism. For a long time, there's been a group of people that Anthropos particularly hated, called Lunosians. They used to be from Espiriq's empire, but oppression from Espiriq called them to leave their homeland and spread around the continent with no country to call home. A large population settled in Anthropos as it was welcoming to more marginalized people, like Anthroposians were at the time. Quickly though, this changed. There are two main ethnic groups of Lunosians. There are Western Lunosians on the left and Eastern Lunosians on the right. In general, the Eastern people acclimated to the culture and blood-centered religion of Anthropos, while the Western people got the brunt of the discrimination from both Anthroposians and eventually their Eastern brethren. This discrimination included open killings to drain their blood and sell it. It quickly turned against Eastern Lunosians as well, as an influential Anthroposian noble put it. Their green eyes betray them. Around this time, the Anthroposian king was caught in an affair with a Western Lunosian woman, calling into question the whole anti-Lunosian movement. Unfortunately, the hatred stood strong. Decades later, in 2000, the king at the time's part Lunosian cousin was an activist against the killings and was able to gather something of an army that wanted to separate itself from Anthropos. The same year, it said that the Allfather validated this new Lunosian king, Mortimer Ferrum, by giving him a legendary sword. The Allfather also validated Anthropos, of course, specifically the king's wife, which brought the two rival nations together for long enough to take over much of the Orient. They divided again quickly, and the Lunosians settled in their old homeland. They're at war with Anthropos to this day, which is where we get to that gruesome aspect of Anthroposian cultures. If you know anything about Anthropos, you probably know about Anthroposian blood wine. However, you might not know the story of why it exists. As Anthropos grew, a big problem arose. Blood taken from captive enemies would go bad before it could even get close to the other side of the country. So the church had an idea, inspired by wine and how that can last for ages. They'd feed their captives nothing but sugar till they died, and then keep their blood in barrels as it aged into alcohol. Now, almost all of the blood drank by Anthroposians is in the form of the infamous Anthroposian blood wine. There's a decent amount of different kinds, though I don't really want to talk about it. Blood wine doesn't have as much iron as blood usually does, supposedly to prevent iron poisoning. There are rumors, though, that Anthropos uses the iron for other purposes. Just to finish up my segment on Lunosians, today Eastern Lunosians still think of themselves as better than the Westerners, and mostly live in better conditions. They speak Anthroposian, and even Western Lunosians still speak a hybrid language, or a Creole, of Anthroposian and a lost Lunosian language. The rising waters due to melting ice caps has caused them to lose a lot of land, weakening their power against Anthropos in the war. Blood wine is illegal in Lunox, but many, especially Eastern Lunosians, still drink the blood of captive enemy soldiers. Lunox is similarly anti-anything that isn't cishet and anti-anything that isn't their own race as Anthropos, and could probably be great friends if they didn't hate each other's guts due to racism. While Anthropos tends to think of itself as the best of the best, Lunox has a weird mix of thinking itself as an underdog and thinking of its enemy as insurmountably strong, while also depicting Anthropos, its enemy, as frail and weak and ugly and so on. The king of Lunox, Mortimer Ferrum, is viewed by his supporters as one of the guys and down to earth, though it seems clear to anyone else that he couldn't care less about the common citizen. He claims he wants to bring back the lost Lunosian culture, but knows nothing about it. To be fair, no one else does either. East Lunosian life and culture revolves mostly around the sea, with fishermen being the most common occupation, next to treasure hunters who look in underwater ruins for something to sell. Between the two Lunosian territories is Middle Anthropos. The average Middle Anthroposian can be seen to the right. They're usually a mix of different ethnic groups, the most common being West Lunosian and South Anthroposian. They usually aren't considered Lunosian though, because they don't usually have green eyes. If a child is born with that trait, they're killed, or the parents have to make the dangerous trek through war-torn areas to live in Lunox, where they will almost certainly face racism as well. A big city in Middle Anthroposia is Bio City, notable for the discovery of black gold. When a mine started and drills were put into the ground, an earthquake opened up the ground, till there was black oil spilling into surrounding land and sea. It's been blamed on the elder god Gentun, who's claimed to have gone mad since the incident. The area around the city is now called the Oil Ocean. No plants grow there, and the water is undrinkable. Though the city is still alive thanks to the oil economy, it's doing much worse than it used to be in terms of population. To talk more about Gentun, they're a symbol of a variety of loosely related things, and can be viewed positively or negatively by different people, or even by different proverbs in the same book. Gentun is the god of the seas, perseverance, greed, diligence, and unrelenting rain. Gentun persevered with his rain, allowing the whole planet to be filled with life from the waters. He had to be diligent with his rain, though, with a steady and controlled flow to keep everyone happy. But going too far can lead to greed. Gentun's unrelenting rain could swallow the whole of Origin. People associate greed with an unrelenting rain of effort, but they also associate the unrelenting rain with perseverance and diligence. Men who don't take no for an answer might associate this with the positive aspects of Gentun, when others think it's clearly the negatives. Gentun is known and respected in the Anthroposian church lore, but he's rarely worshipped. I said Drazi's cults were decentralized, but Gentuns are more so and much rarer. Above that is North Anthropos, as seen on the left. Most of the area used to be Espiriq, and there's lots of old historical cities from that time. They mostly surround what used to be the Lake of Origin, which has recently been divided in two due to a phenomenon called the False Sun. Thousands of years ago, nearly the whole planet revered the most powerful elder god. A minor extinction event in that time covered the sky with darkness, and Origin's sun could not reach us. As the story goes, the only reason anyone is alive today is the goddess of the eternal winter night, Dorothea. She's mostly been forgotten, but the legend revived recently when a bright light shone on the center of the Lake of Origin. Historians and religious personnel called back to the old legend, reminding all of the false sun provided by Dorothea. While Dorothea is associated with warmth and life, she is also associated with disaster. This could be interpreted as Dorothea coming to save us from the disaster that is this world now, or that she's coming to herald a new terrible disaster. Really depends on your point of view. Relatively separate from all that, Dorothea is also known as a two-faced god. In old stories, her appearance is associated with things we normally find cute and unthreatening, suddenly speaking with a strange intelligence. She's also heavily associated with the color white. Some more specific things Dorothea is associated with, other than a gentle white crocodile and a cunning white owl, are white cats, a white forest covered in snow, children born with a mutation that makes them lack melanin and appear almost completely white, and pretty much anything else with a similar mutation. Unlike Drazi and Gentune, Dorothea has a relatively strong worshipper base that has only been gaining popularity. It's called the Cult of Eternal Winter's Night, and their agenda is unknown even to me. North Anthropos is also known for being somewhat separate from the rest of Anthropos, with many citizens defecting to live in the nearby Drydaland or somewhere out of the Orient. Lastly, in Anthropos is the South, as seen on the right. Their most well-known city is called Aura, where a unique sect exists called the Church of Gold. It's kind of its own government, though technically still under the Anthroposian Empire. The Church of Gold is well known for its requirements of followers, including rigorous physical training of themselves and their spirit dog. They congregate in towers around the city, the largest being the tallest building in the world. It creaks to and fro sometimes, but hopefully won't come down crashing anytime soon. A god is known to fly between these towers, known as the Gold Lord or Aura itself. In the lore, it's a wise god among fools, a god of wisdom, but also of opulence. It represents power, prestige, and precious metal. In recent years, though, it's stopped giving its citizens gold in exchange for offerings. It's been spewing mercury instead, poisoning water sources and pretty much everything else. The city has lost much of its prosperity and is beginning to sink into the Anthroposian Empire further and further. The god has also taken a more monstrous form, which people call the Hydra Gyrum. People fear that this oasis of prosperity in southern origin might fall soon, and we'll all be left with nothing but blood-hungry Anthroposians. Before I end with Anthropos, I want to mention some other gods in the lore. These gods aren't backed up by sightings of real creatures, so they're not as popular. I wouldn't say they're any less real, not because I believe in them, but because I don't believe in the ones that have been sighted either. Sure, there's a monster, but there's no proof that they're sentient gods. Anyway, I still think it's worth talking about them because they're so important to the culture. First, I want to mention a kind of obscure one, the Jungle Lights. Originally, it was a story about a monster to keep kids out of dives, a place I'll get to soon, but it sort of evolved to have a spot in the religious lore. There were rumors about a body of the beast being found 100 years ago, but there's really no evidence other than a detailed description of it. It had just been made up. The Jungle Lights represent a god of the unknown, a god of fear and danger. If you hear some people refer to something as their jungle, that's what the phrase comes from. It means they fear it. Technically, it should mean that they fear it specifically because it's unknown and dangerous, but most people kind of just use it as a general fear. Another god known in association with Dorothea is simply called Old Cathedral. The name refers to the building in which a statue representing it was found, a building made a very long time ago. It's in East Anthropos near the lake and is thought to have represented Dorothea, or the false sun. It's a strange looking dragon with a cat head and some sort of bird on its tail, which can be compared to Dorothea, which has a crocodile head and an owl head on the other side. Of course, Old Cathedral isn't actually that, it's just a stone statue that's about 10 feet tall. Surrounded by what looked like lanterns, it was clearly held with some sort of significance. Nowadays, it's viewed as a sort of sidekick to Dorothea, and people occasionally use Old Cathedral to refer to a longtime friend. It's not that important in the grand scheme of things, but I thought it was an interesting god to talk about. There's also Astromyoti, the god of uncanny perfection. Its depictions are really weird, often with inconsistent patterns, faces, and number of fingers. The most common depictions show Astromyoti with 10, 11, or 12 fingers, but older ones sometimes show anything between 6 and 18 fingers in total. The patterns on its torso are never consistent, seemingly just whatever random shapes the artist feels like drawing at the moment. There tend to be two popular styles of Astromyoti depictions, one that leans more toward uncanny with uneven fingers and an asymmetrical face, and another that leans more toward perfection with a perfectly symmetrical face, and features the author or popular culture in general finds attractive. Any good depiction has a good bit of both though, and in my opinion the closer you get to the middle, the better. With visual automatic books, also known as movies, becoming incredibly popular in recent years along with playable movies or video games, the skeptics of the technology's positive potential tend to use Astromyodi as a symbol for the evils of movies and video games. They say the technology is making escapists out of everyone, making them think the impossible idea of perfection could somehow be reality. The main criticism to this argument is that cozy media is just one genre, and many, if not most, visual automatic books depict a world worse than the one we live on. So the idea that people use it to escape is less likely than the idea that people use it simply as entertainment or to enjoy a thought-provoking piece of art. And of course, if people really enjoy media that gives them an escape from reality, the problem might not be the media, but the reality. Anyway, the last god I want to talk about is the Fell Maiden Hydra, or just the Fell Maiden. It's not associated with any sightings of actual critters, but it's one of the more important gods in religious lore. Considered the god of the underworld, they made a dimension the Allfather couldn't reach, where the worst of humanity and those who hated the Allfather were banished to. In the oldest religious lore, the Fell Maiden was depicted as a terrible monster disguised as a young woman who would eat heroes trying to rescue her. These stories were likely fabricated by the subjective kings who wanted to stop do-gooders from breaking into castles and taking back distressed concubines, but more recently the Fell Maiden has become a sort of derogatory allegory for trans women. The idea that they were more sentient and human-like was cemented, and their disguise was just a sick way to trick men. The Fell Maiden Hydra became the deceiver god, the god of homosexual love, which to this day is strictly outlawed in Anthropos and Espiriq. At the same time though, the Fell Maiden is used as a symbol for queer people around the world, especially the Orient. While religious people obviously depict followers of the Fell Maiden as demented cultists, most of these followers don't actually believe the Fell Maiden exists and think of it more as a symbol of anti-religion. They depict the Fell Maiden as a trans woman who created the underworld as a safe haven to protect good people from the blood god. Even in queer circles though, the Fell Maiden is pretty controversial because some are still religious, and some just don't think it's wise to parade a symbol of evil like it represents them just because a few things about it aren't actually evil. At the end of the day, it's really up to your own interpretation on whether you think the Fell Maiden is a good icon or not. It certainly gets people talking about your cause, but may make it harder for people in the middle who are uninformed or misinformed to see things your way. She definitely does look cool though. Next, I want to talk about Espiriq. A once great empire, it was known as the Brazen Kingdom for their discovery and popularization of bronze. Bronze is now primarily used over pure copper in tools, as it's not only harder and more durable, but also less expensive as you're using less copper per kilogram. Still, it requires quite a bit of that, and in recent years, copper is getting rarer and rarer. With how little of it you can find just mining, it's becoming worth it to hire mages to leach copper from the ground in places there's high amounts of it. On the other hand, iron is becoming quite well known as an extremely useful and durable metal, especially in the form of steel, but it's even rarer. Not even leaching it from the ground will give you very much, if any. Almost like someone already did it. Though this is technically a conspiracy theory, it's becoming more widely accepted that that's exactly what happened. Iron in valuable portions is most commonly found in old buried ruins, which can be found all over the world. It's theorized that there was a worldwide empire long ago that used all the iron in the ground, but it's much more likely that there was multiple empires over the course of time. I seriously don't know what people's deal is with world-spanning empires. Just because there's minor similarities doesn't mean you can just ignore all the variation. What makes old ruins so cool is to think of how different all these people were while still being people. Not that there had to be aliens or a different group of people who had to tell them how to stack rocks. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Espiriq. Its empire used to span the globe, but now it's just a shadow of what it once was. Politically, it's kinda like Anthropos, but different, and older. Most adults there have fused with some other life form, and it's a big part of their culture. Most kids have free choice of what they can fuse with, but some limit it to certain things for the sake of a family lineage. For example, a family may feel extremely strongly about how they're all fused with a Rhycorn, which is a goat-type critter with fire magic. They may limit it to anything with fire magic or something more general. Depends mostly on family culture, some things being more or less common depending on where you are. The two remaining kingdoms of Espiriq are divided to the east and west, with neither being particularly more limiting in their choices of fusion. Although homosexuality is strictly illegal in Espiriq, there are rumors that these two kings are gay for each other. I'll let you be the judge of that. Espiriqi religion revolves around spirit fusion and the idea that getting closer to nature around you in this way gets you closer to the Allfather. They believe that the reason you can't directly see the Allfather is because he's fused with everything, and is all around us. Espiriq has its own pantheon of gods, some of whom are shared with Anthropos, but they view their gods very differently. They're much more humanized, for lack of a better word. They're depicted with feelings and emotions and love, with too many stories to count written about the various gods and their relationships. While Espiriqi gods are much more popular in their literature and are known better in Espiriq than Anthroposian gods are known in Anthropos and Lunox, they're also not quite taken as seriously. People don't revolve their lives around the religion as much, other than with spirit fusion. It's sort of expected to believe in these gods as a social thing, but as long as you don't actively speak against it, no one's going to come after you or anything. There are priests who help people with magic and practice more obscure rituals regarding their religion, but other than that, you can kind of just do whatever. Unless you're gay. Or other things, probably. The most popular Espiriqi gods in global pop culture are Zaru, god of wisdom and insanity, and their pantheon leader, god Denari, the peaceful and loving god of thunder and warfare. Okay, I'm being a little silly with the second one. Denari is usually depicted as a terrible god who cares for nothing but the spoils of war, sex, and the sound of booming thunder. But there's an old cult who takes his stories literally while also forgetting 90% of the stories. They pretend Denari is real while none of the other gods are, and depict him as a loving god incapable of error. While they claim the depiction of Denari loves everyone, they also claim he will declare war on non-believers, sentencing them to eternal suffering. This cult is surprisingly popular for how easy it is to disprove its claims, and about 20% of Espiriqi citizens identify with the cult in varying degrees. Might be the music, I've heard it goes hard. They call themselves Disciples of Thunder or Denariites. I know I said they don't think the other gods are real, but Denariite does technically recognize another god, Zaru. They don't think of it as a god though, and their mind is closer to a demon. In Denariite stories, Zaru is a force of mischief that gave humanity the forbidden knowledge of evil, making them imperfect. Denariites are known for their idea of forbidden knowledge as the worst thing ever. They imagine children to be perfect and free from evil, only falling when they learn the evil of the people around them. They value ignorance, seeing education and science as deplorable. Not everyone sees Zaru as an evil character though. Like I said, he's primarily the god of wisdom, even if insanity always follows. Espiriqi culture tends to value wisdom, unless you're Denariite of course, but there's an idea that the wiser you get, the harder it is to avoid insanity. Zaru is really a fascinating god, associated with the most intelligent people, but also with insanity, silliness, and whimsy. Zaru is known globally for the popularization of the idea that play in animals is associated with intelligence, and generally dissipating the idea that there's a hard line between humans and other animals. Of course, Zaru is even better known for all sorts of interesting stories regarding the blurry line between wisdom and insanity. Of course, it's likely that someone considered insane is just that and their brain doesn't work or something, but isn't it interesting to think that they might know something nobody else does? Espiriq used to be large, strong, and prosperous, with expensive, high-quality armor, almost like Anthropos today, but older. How'd they fall so far? Though some may claim it has to do with divine intervention, it's likely just how powerful blood magic can be. Refusing to use it is kinda handicapping yourself. Still, Espiriq has managed to survive the present day even with blood magic outlawed. Though their military used to prioritize quality over quantity, it's more of the opposite nowadays. Still, they're beefed up enough to deter Anthropos, and I guess that's all that matters. The reason quantity over quality works against Anthropos is because with blood magic, Anthropos can basically make any and all of its soldiers extremely powerful with little training. Doesn't really matter much how well trained your soldiers are, they probably won't win a 1v1 against someone who's roided out of their mind and brimming with impossible energy. I'm talking energy that can bring a soldier with a foot in the grave back with the strength to take out a few more enemy soldiers before finally going out with wounds that would kill a normal person 7 times over. There are even rumors of blood-drunk Anthroposians continuing to fight after losing their heads, but that's probably not true. Anyway, if you outnumber these Anthroposian soldiers, it's much more likely that you can stop their rampage midway, or preferably before it happens, allowing you to keep more people than if you just had a few super well-trained soldiers. It also helps that Espiriq is much smaller now, so they can compress and move their army easier to wherever the Anthroposians may attack. While relations between Espiriq and Anthroposia aren't great, they're not at war right now and do trade, so you can expect to see firearms and automobiles if you decide to go to Espiriq, for some reason. I guess I've mostly been saying bad things about Espiriq, so let me give you a reason to go here. Probably shouldn't anyway, but maybe I can get you to think about it. Clemi Bahar is a city near the borders with Anthropos and Lunox, but while it is a center of trade for Espiriq, that's not what it's known for. Clemi Bahar is also close to a place called the Dives, a deep jungle named for the steep valley it sits in. The dives are well under sea level, and to reach it safely one must hike down a treacherous cliff. Escaping it is even more difficult since you have to go up, and it's just a terribly dangerous place in general. Clemi Bahar is the headquarters for where dives research takes place, and there's lots of research there. There are people in the dives who fuse with other organisms that live there like leopards, vultures, and even El Mosco. What makes this so interesting is that if these people have a civilization, it hasn't been found. They haven't even been seen talking to each other. It seems that they fuse with things early in their childhood, earlier than recommended. They seem to do it out of necessity as well, for example, fusing with a leopard that's attacking you so you don't die. Because of these conditions, the fusions are often botched, with a common side effect of losing much of their human intelligence. There are also people who seem to have fused with plants with heads like flowers. It's unknown how or if their brain works or what the hell is going on with their biology. They're not seen very often, and fusing with an immobile plant doesn't really fit the theory that they fuse out of necessity. The dives is also where the myth of the jungle lights comes from, and other than the little plant fellows called jungle spirits which are part of the myth, so far nothing resembling a three-headed, long-necked monster with the faces of people have been found, so that's probably completely made up. Doesn't this place sound fun though? What a great reason to come to Espiriq! Next is Taurus, another country with 2 kingdoms and a predominantly fusion-based population. Still, it's very different from Espiriq. The culture around fusion places much more importance on what you fuse with and how you fuse with it, thinking highly of a clear cut between man and animal. A majority of people also choose to keep their torso mostly unchanged in fusion, while their bottom half is replaced with the body of the animal they chose, usually adding limbs leading to a total of 6. Taurus also has a ban on blood wine, but they still trade with Anthropos, the most important thing being firearms. You probably won't find many automobiles in Taurus, but law enforcement will have guns while those are banned for the common citizen. They worship the Allfather in a way similar to Espiriq, but call it a different thing. While the main religion of Taurus is technically more involved than Espiriq's, they're more okay with you not believing in it. Their main ritual is meeting with other believers once a week and eating, but only about a third go every week and another third goes a few times in a year. There's no written punishment for not going, it's sort of just a social thing. Legally, Taurus is definitely one of the better countries in the Orient for queer or otherwise unusual sorts of people, but with a greater potential for extremely devoted religious people, hate crimes aren't uncommon. The north is considered Taurus proper, while the south is a territory they conquered long ago. Most people equate them, but Taurasians think of the two as distinctly different. Still, they operate like 2 joint kingdoms, except one of the kingdoms gets the final say on things. Obviously, southern Taurus doesn't like that, but any threats to secede aren't taken seriously because they'd rather be under Taurus than Anthropos. They hold Anthroposians back the same way Espiriq does, but if the Taurasian army left the south or even just split apart, Anthropos would almost certainly take it as soon as they could. Before I get to Drydaland, I want to talk about bears. The Kaidos bear was recently added to the official sapient species list of Draconia. If we look at a map from the Orient where they hail, we can see what look like countries in the bottom left, Ursa and Titania. Unfortunately, they're not really countries, as Kaidos don't really work together in groups like that. Ursa is a territory that Anthropos has blocked off till further notice, because they found that these bears are too hard to kill and basically left them to their own devices in these territories. Titania has a similar story, but from Espiriq rather than Anthropos. Kaidos are brutally killed if they stray into other countries because they're considered dangerous by these humans. It's so bad that Anthropos and Espiriq, 2 previously warring countries that you'd think hate each other more than anything, have actually been in talks to work together to exterminate Kaidos once and for all. These bears are really smart though, and it's actually extremely rare for them to stray to other countries right now. At the same time, they're more hostile to humans than they used to be, and being banished to the territories of Ursa or Titania are basically a death sentence. You might be wondering how and why there was any movement strong enough on the other side of the planet to warrant politicians adding them to the sapient species list. In an effort to escape to somewhere more free, Kaidos were actually the first Oriental sapient life to get to the Occident. They used rafts they built from bringing down trees and holding them together with animal skin. Of course, not everyone who tried this has landed in the Occident, but enough have for us to have learned this much about them. They're very capable at learning common, though they can't speak much more than ahs, ohs, and growls. Their preferred method of communication is by waving their arms in specific ways alongside vocal cues, but they can communicate with people who only speak common using the famous s'more code. This code is usually used in long and short beeps, but Kaidos can speak this relatively efficiently by replacing short beeps with the ah sound and long ones with the growl. Yeah, they literally talk like ah, ah, ra, ra. I just said I am gay in Kaidos' s'more code. It's true. Kaidos are one of the most discriminated against people in Draconia, and with many people citing their dislike of clothing and difficulty in speech as reasons they shouldn't be considered sapient. Next, Drydaland. It's a unique little country, the first to have no official religion. It operates democratically, with citizens voting on government officials every set amount of years. Drydaland established itself in 2000 as a response to Anthropos' takeover of the Orient. Drydaland was founded by Asterius Kinagot, also known as the Twice-Cursed Prince. Drydaland is mostly populated by elves, which are a different species of humanoid I haven't talked about in this video yet. Humanoids on origin constitute one lineage, but it came about long enough ago that there are two taxonomic genuses of humanoid. One is of course Homo, which represents the vast majority including Homo sapiens, Noir, and Trifol. The second genus is Drydalis, which represents what we know as elves. There are three different species of elves which weren't well understood until recently. Witches are an important part of their story, and all you really need to know about them is that their dark magic affects someone's DNA. As the story goes, an elf who took a detour to avoid treading water was cursed by a witch to live in water for the rest of his life. His brother tried to fight the witch and was cursed to only know combat and aggression. The last brother was wise and avoided the witch. No one has ever observed a witch to give such thoughtful curses, so it's likely that aspect of the tale is untrue. Also, it's unlikely for someone to survive an attack like this, much less live to reproduce and pass down the messed up genes. However, the amount of change in so little time between these three species can only be explained by a witch. The only elf species currently considered sapient is the one that's just known as the common elf, though the status of the other two is hotly debated. These people are weird in more ways than one. Not only are they short and stout like the other elves, their most significant oddity is their near-complete lack of sexual dimorphism. Down to the private parts, it's impossible to know whether an elf gives or gets pregnancies without a surgery or a DNA test, and even then it's not 100% certain. Because of this, their idea of gender is extremely loose. It has more to do with personal choice and identity rather than appearance. It was assumed that this was the product of regular evolution because there's no way their people would be corrupted and mindless like the other witch-gened elves. However, the Twice-Cursed Prince proved them wrong, as he is not only tall as a human, but also has more typical mammalian sex characteristics. Drydaland banned Anthroposian blood wine and firearms, but still trade with Anthropos extensively. The main trades are automobiles and black gold, both of which Drydaland has innovated on. It's introduced gas-powered boats, trains, and most recently airplanes to the world stage. Also electricity generators to allow for more innovations in the field of electricity. Before I end the section of the Orient, yeah, I've got even more countries to talk about, I want to note how much the rising sea level and climate change in general has affected these places. You might have noticed how weird cities are near the seaside border. Even for the lake, cities don't touch the lake but are a few miles away. Why would they do that when they can be right up against the water source? The answer is that they were right up against the water source, but the water source moved. In the case of the lake, it's been getting smaller, but in the case of the seas, they've been rising. The only place rich enough to put up walls to stop the sea rushing in is western Anthropos, especially around the big city. Every other territory has gotten smaller from the rising seas taken over. Cities have had to move and build new settlements, leaving their history behind to be washed away. Now, onto the glaciant. Usually, organisms adapted for cold want less surface area, because more surface area means more heat loss. Trifol evolved another method, by eating the mana-rich fruit of the Doro tree common to the more temperate regions of the glaciant. While ancestors of the Noir who ate the Doro, which is what they call the fruit, processed the mana within their stomachs to become the overflowing magic we know as the Dead Flame, ancestors of Trifol had a more internal reaction. The Doro warmed their bodies so intensely that they could only have a little at a time. As they depended on the fruit to stay warm and survive in the cold climate, Their bodies adapted to it and got used to its effects, requiring more Doro as their internal body temperature slowly adapted to being higher and higher. Today, the Trifol have one of the highest natural body temperatures of all animals, averaging around 50 degrees. Without at least one Doro fruit worth of mana per day, they'll start to suffer symptoms of hypothermia, even in room temperature. Their bodies are adapted to release a lot of heat, so they can easily survive Doro overdoses and even warm the room around them for babies who can't regulate their body temperature yet. Speaking of babies, Trifol have some weird adaptations for making them. High temps seem to denature proteins, which is really bad in general, though it does kill most diseases, but it's super bad for something like little cells that aren't adapted to stuff like that, like sperm, eggs, and a developing baby. Trifol have a decently thick pad that separates their stomach from their womb, absorbing much of the heat and keeping the womb cool. On top of that, the onset of pregnancy slows mana flow in the area to cool it down. Further still, Trifol ejaculate, on top of the alkalinity to circumvent the acidity of the vagina, has a cooling effect that allows the sperm to survive. Anyway, Trifol are famous for their ethereally glowing stripes, which radiate warmth to a degree depending on a variety of factors outside the Trifol's control. Trifol are one of the less social-sapient species on Origin, usually living alone or in a small family. They tend to live in houses with a lot of land around it, separated from another house by more than a kilometer. Most people don't leave their land more often than once a year, but kids will usually leave once they become an adult to search for either a new place to live or on their own, or a partner to live with. So it's not uncommon to have random people knocking at your door in Clover and offering to help with whatever random stuff. Clover is the country inhabited mostly by Trifol, by the way. In these plots of land, it's common to have a farm with plants and animals to live off, a tree field for lumber, a body of water or a well to drink from, a kiln to fire things and use, sometimes even things like a forge, a mine, a library, or whatever people in the house might be interested in. Thanks to the internet, it's easy to be well informed about anything without going outside, and the internet is especially well developed in Clover. If someone is a known toolsmith, they might get messages from people asking for tools made, and usually the requests are accepted without any immediate payment. However, it is expected for someone to reciprocate the help in some reasonable way if asked. For example, if a toolsmith makes a hoe for a gardener, it might be expected for the gardener to bring tomatoes to the toolsmith if they ask. If they don't, word will get around and they might not get much of anything from anyone else until they start helping others. A well-known figure in Clover is Joseph Novak Jr., also known as the Bad King. He's really, really weird. His mother was the last queen of Clover, who married a very strange man. Her husband seemed like the hybrid of an elf and a human, but also none of those. He had a large bald spot on his head, clipped ears, and sometimes water would fall from his head or his arms. Joseph inherited many of his father's traits and is much shorter than any adult Trifol. He may be weird, but he's someone to take seriously. Not long ago, people in Clover lived very differently from how I described. Each home and its surrounding land was owned by a number of nobles, with each noble owning 50 to 150 of these households. The people of these households would be required to give a percentage of what they make to the nobles. For example, a toolsmith might be required to make 100 swords by the end of the year, and a gardener might be required to make 100 kilos of tomatoes. They were also used as fodder in squabbles between nobles. The nobles, though, were owned by a number of barons, who owned 50 to 150 of the nobles and made sure they got what they were supposed to. The nobles would give a percentage of what they took from the households to the barons, but that's not it, because the barons were owned by a monarch. This system stood for hundreds of years until Joseph Novak Jr. With the rise of the internet, he led a revolution by bringing the populace together and realizing they outnumbered the nobles by a lot. He wrote extensively about his plans of what a better society could be, with his book called Lowercase. Only 4 years ago, there was a violent revolution in Trifol where Novak killed his own mother, and power changed hands. Part of how this was able to happen, and how the revolutionaries didn't realize their leader was just another monarch, was that at the time, the queen wasn't known to have a son. She was known to have a daughter. Novak didn't reveal that he grew up as the princess until more recently, but it explained a lot about how he was able to infiltrate the nobility from the inside. His sword is an enchanted relic made for his grandfather, a king from long ago, and he sort of rides it around. People call him the Bad King because he betrayed his own family and destroyed the establishment that was around for centuries. The name sort of took off within his own circle though, so even people who like him may call him that. Novak hopes that his successful revolution will inspire others around the world to do something similar, so he continues to write more literature about the subject. I also want to talk about religion in Clover. It's very notable for being the only legal system to have ever banned religion. While some may blame this for them being godless heathens, it's much more complicated than that. For one, while the law is technically still on the books, it hasn't been enforced for more than 200 years. Also, there's evidence that it was never fully enforced. The reason it came into law is because of a phenomenon called fairy circles. There's a rare organism in the area called a fairy leaf. It's a strange plant that can fly, though only in its seed form. They tend to arrange themselves in curious circles that contrast their surroundings with pink leaves and a strange dust floating within the circle. People who walk into these 2 to 3 meter radius circles will immediately feel a wave of pleasure paired with sleepiness. As soon as they hit the ground, they scream inconsolably until they are removed from the circle. Oftentimes, many people will get stuck in the circle as new people trying to help also fall into the trap. By the way, these effects don't only affect people, and this will more or less happen to any large enough warm-blooded animal who steps into the circle. A non-sapient animal rescued from the circle will live as normal until a certain thing happens, but a person able to recall their experience will speak of a utopia called ethos. They'll say they had the best time of their life and may even show aggression at being removed from the circle. Most will wish to go back, but either way something will happen about 2 weeks in, for any animal affected. It will quickly get harder and harder to breathe until their lungs collapse and they quickly die. If the victim is studied at any point during this process, a growing tree will be found embedded in the base of their lungs. If allowed to continue, it will grow into a new fairy tree that eventually releases its own fairy seeds. In the wild, fairy trees can be seen growing on rotting corpses, sometimes in large piles with a tree for each corpse. They'll eventually root into the ground as normal, but often will still be in a weird pile. As you can imagine, people hate these trees and cut them down whenever possible, so they can only be found in the outskirts where people rarely go. Okay, so you might be wondering what that has to do with the banning of religion. Well, these people talking about ethos and turning into trees kinda turned into a big religious thing. Movements started preaching that the Fairy King would bring everyone away from the terrible world. This was outlawed because it was leading to many deaths, including some that wanted nothing to do with the Fairy King movement. It was the only real religion in Clover at the time, so general wording was used to ban it and reduce chances of it coming back. Noir is a large country that takes up much of the glacier, but it's mostly desert. There are a few cities strewn about the ocean border, but the largest by far is just called Noir City, or Noir proper. It used to be filled with a group of people called Noir, but they went through a catastrophe that killed almost all of them. Only 5 men survived the terrible disease and 1 woman who died in childbirth. Today, there's only 1 Noir left alive. His name? James Noir. Yeah, that word appears a lot, huh? James Noir is the mayor of the city, but he wasn't elected. Noir politics is a bit more complicated than that, and to understand their culture in general, let's talk about their religion. Noir religion obviously doesn't exist anymore since they're functionally extinct, but even when it did, it was really less of a practicable religion and more of a belief system. It's more similar to Lycan beliefs than anything else, with an emphasis on an individual rather than a distant god. But Noir religion doesn't say everyone is part of a god, it's more that every Noir has the potential to be a god. Noir religion is about power and domination over your fellow man. Noir were some of the most powerful people to ever live, with their tiny country able to square up against the Empire of Draconia in its prime. The Noir express their magical power by dominating their environment, usually affecting color somehow. The last regime is known as the Dead Flame, sapping the color from its surroundings. It can still be seen in Noir City, held up by the last Noir alive. The regime before that was the Invert Kingdom, which ended centuries ago with a dramatic and historic battle between the 2 most powerful men of their time. James Noir is in power because his regime never fell, and he can prove his political power with physical power. He's close friends with Joseph Novak and plans to shift his politics to be more like Clover. It's starting from something much different though, since they use money to trade things on the spot, rather than the system Clover is used to. On top of that, the main change that Clover made was to remove the middleman of the nobles. That way, they gained the power to dictate their own lives, and all they really had to do was organize a bit of an army to make sure they can still be protected. Noir, though, operates very differently. Their commoners don't simply live their lives and give a percentage of their goods to nobles. These commoners instead have to sell their labor to higher-ups that give them enough money to survive. Selling your labor basically just means working under someone. These higher-ups often have higher-ups who tell them what to do, and so on. So if you take out the middleman in this situation, you end up with a lot of people who don't know what to do. For example, a toolsmith might have to make some number of axes dictated by their higher-up, who sells those axes for some amount of money. They make enough axes that they'll be able to sell most of what they make. The problem is that they don't know the people they're selling the axes to, and it certainly wouldn't make sense to just give them out for free like they do in Clover because of that. You don't really have any way of knowing how or if they'll ever pay you back. You need a lot of changes to your life before you can get to a society like Clover's. So James Noir will probably start with some simpler things, for example figuring out some way for people to have shelter and get food without having to sell their labor, or at least regulating it somehow. Okay, so I've been talking about Noir for a while, and I did start off by saying that they're effectively extinct. So who the heck is living there? It's become a haven for people around the world to start a new life. Noir City is one of the most diverse places in the world, where you can find pretty much anyone from any background. Before I end this section on Noir and the whole video finally, I want to talk about some theories regarding where that disease that wiped out the Noir came from. There's really one main theory and many branching ones. We've established that Noir belief systems revolved around power and who could be the strongest. Noir had always been a leader in technology, and they definitely had a good idea of what causes disease. Because the disease that wiped them out couldn't be traced back to any real source outside them, it's possible, even likely, that the disease was created by Noir. Why? Well, supposedly to weed out the weakest in the population. Noir leaders seem to have even hinted about the disease years before it came out, saying things about how the weakest were going to be tested soon. There were different theories about whether opposing or spying regimes tried to knock out the dead flame with this, and it was relatively accepted that the disease was engineered by proponents of the Invert Kingdom. But recently this has shifted. Not including James Noir and his mother, the 5 surviving men were brothers leading the dead flame regime. It seems they had quarantined while the disease spread and managed to avoid it entirely. The idea that they had found out about the disease and managed to quarantine in time because they were so intelligent was spread by these brothers, but after their deaths, more and more information is coming out about how they planned the whole thing. They didn't plan for it to kill as many people as it did, but they were hoping to wipe out most of their competition. The leader of the dead flame at the time, who likely came up with the whole thing, was William Noir, who died peacefully in his bed at the age of 118. James Noir, his grandson, obviously had nothing to do with the whole thing because he wasn't even born yet, but he has apologized for it on many occasions in the last 4 years since his grandfather died. That's all for this video. I've talked about various cultures, religions, and political systems of countries around the Orient, and about half of the Glaciant. Specifically the countries founded by humanoids in the Glaciant, of course. This video was an absolute blast to make, and it was probably just scratching the surface of all there is to learn about humanoids. Truly, thank you for making it this far and being interested in my little world. Check out my Patreon, where you can support me for just $1 a month and get your name at the end of my videos. Thanks Captain Kobop, Art of Dying, and Mr. Kill. I'm thinking my next anthropology video will be about sapient predators and sapient prey.